welcome up into the space.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
My apologies for being late. This is my incompetence with Twitter shining through, but it's a real pleasure to be with you all.
No worries at all. Thank you very much for joining us, Ian. It's a pleasure, and thanks very much to Peter for arranging you having a segment with us here. We're very pleased to have someone who's actually worked in national security and the Department of Defense for quite some time. So thank you.
It's a pleasure.
If I might introduce you, Ian, and then I'd ask Axel or Domen, our two co-hosts, to share a little bit about the Walter Report and Maria Aid. And then I think we should just get right into it. We should talk about some pressing questions of the day. What does winning look like for Ukraine? Where is NATO and the Transatlantic Alliance lining up in support or perhaps objection to Ukraine's future integration? And what is needed right now to help Ukraine win this fight? As many of you know, Ian Brzezinski is one of the leading, I would say, strategic thinkers of our time. Ian, he has worked in the Department of Defense as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. He is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I've known him for many years. And Ian, if I can say, I have learned much about Poland and NATO and, frankly, how the world works from your insight. So thank you, Ian. Axel, Ian knows a little bit about the Walter Report and Maria Aid. You want to share some more?
Yeah, with pleasure. So, Ian, the way this all works and how it all came together is quite Ukrainian, quite literally Ukrainian. It's extremely decentralized. Our friend and co-founder of the space, Walter, started in the days prior to the invasion, talking to friends and other activists about the threat of the Russian invasion. And he was online with his own Twitter space, like this one here, the evening before the invasion. And as it was the evening in the US, things started to heat up in Ukraine. And in consequence, as soon as the invasion actually occurred and live pictures and live news came out from on site, people started calling in, reporting, talking to him, and giving information from on the ground in Ukraine, which led to more people in the US coming in. Many thousand people followed. And in very short order, it became a global information space. Many of us here who never knew Walter beforehand at all joined in, became regular speakers, and it spiraled, not out of control, but it spiraled forward so that essentially since the 23rd of February, we're online 24/7. And what the space does, we create information awareness. We bring in experts from all fields of policy, national security, military. We have a load of the military guys with us. We do energy policy. We discuss the events on location. We try to bring transparency and clarity into what actually happens in the battlefield space. We'll try to make sense of the news of the day. We'll try to find ways as to how the interviews, discussions, decisions by policymakers in Europe and the US impact the battle for freedom by Ukraine, and how we all deal with the threat of Russia and what would happen after a victory by Ukraine. So it's essentially a full-blown news operation. On the one hand, creating this information awareness, we deal with trolls and the insidious works by Moscow centers, peons on a regular basis. Here, we try to deconstruct them. We're polite, firm, and typically we discard them with a bit of charm and sometimes a bit more directly. At the same time, a large part of our group is essentially manned and said not just manned, it's on the contrary. It is provided for and organized by men and women who were part and parcel of the Operation Unifier by CAF, by the Canadian Armed Forces, who for about 8 years, with a small Swedish contingent on the side, worked on the improvement of and transition of the Ukrainian Armed Forces from its previous, lackluster, still Soviet-style setup to what is effectively today a very, very suitable, albeit still under-equipped, modern army. And the people who were there, including the leadership, especially the last leader of Operation Unifier, Colonel Melanie Lake, sat around in those days when the invasion occurred and simply couldn't sit still. So they had to do something and joined the effort by Walter and one of our friends here on the program, Yehuda, is also part and parcel of that operation, and took this all by the short and curlies and went forward to say, okay, fine, we will try to organize those things which Ukraine can never have enough of, and that is the consumables of war, the non-lethal aid, be it tourniquets, IFAKs, but also helmets, night vision goggles, plate carriers. You know what happens when a plate gets shot or a plate carrier gets ruined or ripped and the likes. It can't be used anymore. So the more, the merrier. The more, the better, any given time. So Maria Aid was conceived and has become now a registered not-for-profit and charitable organization in Canada. We're expanding this further. And through Water Report, we've started to raise donations from all over the world, but of course, a large part in North America, both the US as well as Canada, in order to generate more commitments and more support as requested by the counterparts of Operation Unifier, who all sit both in the Ministry of Defense, all the way up to Mr. Reznikov, as well as in the Ministry of Veterans Affairs and Ministry of Health in Ukraine. So our boys and girls get lists every week from the different units, and then we know what actually is required. And we try to match donations and our capacity, and our people in Canada, many of whom have been working with Maria Aid, are essentially volunteers who have donated their own money to the logistics. So it's not that we take in donations and then out of $100 of a donated money, some goes to logistics and the rest goes to administration effort. On the contrary, all of this, what you see here, be it the information space as well as Maria Aid, is a fully volunteer army of people who dedicate their time, resources, and their money. This is the best form of the arsenal of democracy from my point of view, because we really mean it. We have people who have donated thousands and thousands of dollars in order to pay for the logistics of shipping palletized IFAKs, helmets, and tourniquets to Ukraine. And we continue to do so, and we will be here in this information space live 24/7, talking to the world and raising money until Ukraine has won and restored its sovereignty. That's us.
We're very happy to have you, Ian. As Axel said, you can see this is a very dynamic and high-impact effort that's going on. Ian, I know that there's a lot of interest that you've joined us. There's been a lot of interest, and there's a question we keep coming back to again and again, and I think you might be able to share some insight on this. And that question is, what does winning look like for Ukraine, and where are we in the state of play right now with regard to Western support?
Okay, well, that's a pleasure. Well, this is an impressive group you've convened, and I've heard about it before, and I'm doing my research. I'm amazed at the breadth that you have. So it's a real honor for me to be joining you all. If I understand correctly, Peter, you want me to talk about 5 or 6 minutes on what does success look like and how do we get there?
Or I think that would be perfect.
Concise.
Yep. And then, 5 to 6 minutes would be great. And then, we'll field some questions and we'll just have a good conversation.
Great. Well, I thought what I would do is just kind of share my perspective on, basically what's at stake, what we've done right and wrong, what needs to be done, and then really kind of get to the core of what does success look like. And I think that's actually a fairly simple answer and pretty direct answer. But this conflict's been going on for well over 100 days, and there is a lot at stake. And when I think about that, I think of basically kind of 4 realms. One is very obvious. It's Ukraine's sovereignty and survival. This is the sovereignty and survival of a European democracy, a democracy that features one of Europe's most politically tolerant societies, a success story, actually, I think, in the post-Cold War era, in light of the pressures that Ukraine has been driving forward reform to amidst, Russian constant harassment, economic pressures, sanctions, embargoes, and now 2 invasions. At stake is also the preservation of the rules-based order. If Putin's allowed to prevail, we're going to find ourselves on track back to a world dominated by spheres of influence and military coercion. And this time, I would argue, a world that features more active nuclear coercion in light of the way that Putin has been exercising nuclear threats in this conflict. And as we just approach the upcoming NATO summit at the end of this month, we should not forget that NATO's credibility is at stake. And what the alliance does and doesn't do is going to shape the confidence not only of partners like Ukraine have in NATO, but its own member states, and the respect that it garners among its adversaries, and first and foremost, Putin. And then I'd add, harking back to my own father and his writings, my father, Zbigniew Brzezinski, used to emphasize that Russia cannot be a democracy if it continues to be an empire. And Moscow's resubordination of Ukraine by brute force would preclude, certainly, Russia's transition from its hegemonic past. So at stake is Russia's own evolution as democracy and an international actor. Now, what have we done right and what have we done wrong? And here I'm looking primarily at the Biden administration, which really has emerged as the lead of the international coalition supporting Ukraine in resisting this Russian invasion. You know, on the positive side of the ledger, there is an international coalition supporting Ukraine, and that has largely been driven by the United States, and we need to give the Biden administration credit for that. They've developed a robust economic and military assistance supply chain. It's not quite enough, but I'll get there. But it is something we haven't done to this extent any time before. And nearly all NATO allies are sending military equipment. There are robust economic sanctions. Again, I'll emphasize later on, it's not enough, but they're pretty robust. And all our allies and partners are imposing sanctions. And we're controlling the narrative, which we didn't really do in the first year of this conflict. On the sadder side, on the unfortunate side, we were very slow. The West was very slow to recognize and act on clear signals of Putin's intent. You might notice I didn't just say 100 days, I said a year. In my view, this conflict began in March of 2021, when Russia started massing forces on Ukraine's border and on the territories it was occupying, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, injecting those regions full of offensive strike capacities. The Russians, you may remember, even closed off a significant part of the Black Sea and literally shut off the Sea of Azov. There were no sanctions in response to that a year ago today. And I really think that, those actions by Russia signaled the run-up to the February 24th invasion. And right in advance of that invasion, did we hunker down? No. We withdrew our embassy. We withdrew our military forces from Western Ukraine. What a terrible signal of confidence to the Ukrainians, and what a red flag or a green light, so to speak, to Russia to move forward with this invasion on that fateful February 24th day. And when you look back at our strategy, from a year ago and then over the last 100 and so days, one thing that strikes me, it's been a strategy of incrementalism. Incremental steps of military assistance, incremental economic sanctions. We didn't go full bore like where we are today. We trickled this stuff in. And when you do that, what does that communicate to an authoritarian that has already invaded Ukraine before, Georgia before, and really not sustained much punishment for that? Well, the parallels of the strategy of incrementalism is that it communicates hesitancy on part of the West, a lack of unity among the West, a lack of determination, and maybe even intimidation in the face of Russian military threats and military actions. And that, of course, emboldens Putin, enhances his confidence and his willingness to use military force in support of his revanchist ambitions. And, why are we stuck with this strategy of incrementalism? It's probably because, we are intimidated by Russia's nuclear threats and fear of directly engaging Russian forces and communicating that. We're driven by a desire for, full unanimity among our allies, bringing us down to the lowest common denominator of action. And as a result, I think we mistakenly and unfortunately denied Ukraine the additional momentum it could have used in the first phase of conflict so that it would be better positioned than it is today, particularly as Russian forces have been massed and are beginning to drive forward for a significant land grab in eastern and southern Ukraine. So what do we need to do? We've got to continue accelerating the flow of military equipment, ammunition, and other supplies, including increased capabilities, particularly long-range strike and aircraft. It's beyond me why we haven't imposed a full trade and financial embargo on Russia. I mean, today we're still spending billions of dollars a week buying Russian oil and gas. And that, of course, facilitates Putin's invasion. It finances it. And moreover, it communicates a lack of will and determination that further emboldens Putin. And of course, we have to reinforce NATO's eastern frontier, moving our NATO eastern frontier from a strategy of tripwire defense with light deployments to a real strategy of denial, which will involve heavier deployments. And hopefully the NATO summit will push us in that direction. I've argued also that we ought to establish, through the deployment of Western military forces, a humanitarian no conflict zone in Western Ukraine, the area that isn't occupied by Russian forces. My goodness, there is a real need for a safe haven for Ukraine's millions of refugees. This would enable us to more effectively enable humanitarian assistance. It would also further reinforce our confidence in the territorial perpetuation of Ukraine. It would also allow the Ukrainians to further concentrate their forces on where they need it most instead of being spread out on 3 strategic frontiers. Of course, there would be a risk of escalation in this, but I think it's manageable because we wouldn't be deploying Western forces into the line of confrontation with Russia or where Russian forces are. The ball would be really put in Putin's court on whether or not he wanted to strike at those forces. And I'm not sure, based on the performance of Russian forces today, he'd really want to be taking on far more capable Western forces. And another element of the West strategy of something that must be done, we need to seriously start thinking about how to economically reinforce Central and Eastern Europe and begin the process of planning and preparation for the reconstruction of Ukraine. This is really important. So, what is the definition of success for Ukraine? That, of course, is what the Ukrainians have to determine. Their future is at stake, and they have to determine what they define success as. But in my humble opinion, what I would like to see is an end of a conflict that features the reconstitution of Ukraine's territorial integrity, including to its 2014 borders, and its freedom to fully join the European Union and NATO. And I'm glad there seems to be momentum in the EU to finally grant Ukraine long overdue deserved candidate status for EU membership. And above all, that outcome, which has to be negotiated and driven by the Ukrainians and supported by the West, has to be one that has to be fair in Ukraine's own mind, and it has to ensure that Russia and other revanchist powers will be deterred from committing such aggression against Ukraine, be it Russia or other aggression elsewhere in the world in the future. And for me, it's very hard to envision any outcome that allows Russia to sustain any control over Ukrainian territory that is seized from Ukraine or that limits Ukrainian sovereignty as being successful, as not awarding aggression. Ukraine has to be free to choose its own security relationships, including NATO membership. It's in our interest to see Ukraine free, democratic, and fully sovereign. And supporting this is the morally right thing to do and strategically right thing to do in our own interests. I hope that's useful.
That was
Thank you very much. Peter.
Ian, something that you said really got my attention. You were talking about this humanitarian safe zone, a zone that where refugees from conflicts, parts of Ukraine that are currently in conflict, refugees and civilians could know that they were safe. Implicit in that are 2 important things that I heard from you. One, this would require some kind of Western backing, and 2, it would send a clear and resounding message: Ukrainian sovereignty here is going to survive. It is inviolable. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I think that is a very powerful recommendation that deserves some exploration.
Well, the assumption I'm making is that time is not on Ukraine's hands. We're talking about an imbalance between Ukraine, which has a population of 45 million, and Russia 142 million. Russia has a GDP of what, $1.4 trillion or so. Ukraine's probably less than a tenth of that. We're talking before the war started. A Ukrainian defense budget of what, $5 to $6 billion, $7 billion at most, and a Russian defense budget around 70 to 80, maybe higher, billion dollars. And if this becomes a war, kind of just attrition, well, the advantages are to Russia, and that's just kind of where we seem to be sifting. So I don't think time is on our side, and so we need more decisive support than just providing the Ukrainians more weapons. To perpetuate a war in which it'll be, continuously ground down by an adversary who's willing to sacrifice without any remorse countless Russian lives. So a deployment of a force into Ukraine, into areas, into Western Ukraine, which is not held by Russian forces, Russian forces are at the northeast border of border area of Ukraine, of course, in significant portions of Donetsk and Luhansk, and a significant chunk of the coastline going almost all the way to Odessa. If Western forces were to go and deploy and say 20, 50 clicks away from the line of confrontation, that would not be an aggression against Russian forces. So therefore, we're not precipitating conflict with Russia. We'd be allowing the Ukrainians to continue and more effectively continue their battle against the Russians. It would preclude Russia's ability to use Belarus to generate another front against the Ukrainians. And above all, would allow them to concentrate their forces more effectively against a decisive battle that's happening today in eastern Ukraine, and more effectively against the continued battles along the southern frontier. This is something that we could do. It is something that I don't think Putin is prepared to counter. It would certainly demonstrate to Putin and his commanders, far more effectively the resolve we should be having, or I hope we have, to defend Ukraine. And I think that is a situation in which you provide Ukraine better circumstances, a better situation in which to go to a negotiating table to bring an end to this conflict. Hello?
Yep, we got you, Ian. So we've got a couple of questions here in the space. I want to give our hosts a chance to weigh in. Axel or Domin, did you want to weigh in? Otherwise, we'll go to Maciej.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things which are to be highlighted. I fully agree with the approach Ian has taken in requiring and say also admonishing the West for not delivering long-range artillery earlier and in bigger number, but specifically withholding long-range missiles. I mean, the Gimlers are great, they're fantastic, and bringing them into theater is superb. But the HIMARS system can actually work perfectly well with ATACMS, which would give Ukraine the capacity to hit those supply routes and effect deep strikes to get rid of the maintenance depots, which the Russian side is currently using in battlefield far behind the third echelons in order to actually, keep its current concentrated troops in Donbass afloat. And it would allow it to keep hitting troops, garrisons, and locations of interest on Crimea, which so far are completely out of reach. It is important in order to reach specific locations required to eliminate in the Kherson Oblast, and we would be best advised to provide them ATACMS at the earliest possible time. This goes beyond everything which we do economically. This is a simple military choice which we have to make, and this goes hand in hand with, and I think Ian will be on our side in this regard, in providing them against the seemingly Franco-German blockage of releasing existing sources of Recce tanks, the Leopard 1, as well as proper main battle tanks, the Leopard 2, into theater. And one can only hope, I may add, Ian, what do you think about this, given the fact that, fortunately, Great Britain is yet again, as always, not just the number 2 in NATO, but the most steadfast ally of the defense of freedom, that the UK should release as many Challies, meaning Challenger tanks, as it can do out of its current upgrade program, and hand them to the Ukrainians, because they're certainly good enough to work with them, and they're great main battle tanks. And failing the upping of the MLRS capacity and failing having more rocket artillery and theater, at least we should give them long-range missiles and those battle tanks.
No, I'm in complete agreement. I our hesitancy and our vocal communication of our hesitancy to provide those long-range strike abilities, again, is just the wrong messages. You want Russia to be, never sure about what we're not going to do, and always fearful of what we could do, and what Ukraine could do, and how we could help Ukraine to do. So, first there's the failure to provide that capability, and then there's the mistake of articulating why we're not providing that capability, which demonstrates kind of a lack of resolve and a fear of escalation. and that just Putin feeds on that. He uses it to undermine Ukrainian confidence in the West, and it emboldens him. So I'm still scratching my head as to why we don't provide those capabilities. And the only excuse for not providing those capabilities is that we might not have enough of them, and that's a different issue. But that's not the reason why we're not providing them those capabilities, and that's a mistake.
Fully agreed. Thank you, Domin.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you for being with us, Ian. It's really fantastic to have you with us. How have you found this slow coalescing of unity in Europe and the West more broadly? It seemed initially that maybe after the first few days that the West, the broader West, will coalesce around the same position very quickly, but then we saw that some countries very soon thereafter started dragging their feet rather, and took a lot longer to come to the same conclusions as, say, the US, the UK, Poland, the Baltic states did.
Well, for me, it's been unbelievably frustrating. It's been heartbreaking. As somebody who spent 2 years in Ukraine as a volunteer back in '93 and '94, I had great affection for that country, and I fully understand and experience its full Europeanness. But while it's frustrating to me and heartbreaking to me, it's deadly for the Ukrainians. And, they're losing lives as a result of this hesitancy and this incrementalism. I just wonder where we would be if back in March, April of 2021, instead of looking at our shoes, we'd actually increased our deployments to Western Ukraine and started flowing more prominently, more aggressively, and in greater volume some of the security assistance that we're providing today to the Ukrainians. They would have been better prepared, but more importantly, it would have demonstrated to the Russians that we would have no toleration for any such of the type of aggression that they launched on February 24th. If we had done that back a year ago, I don't think we'd be in the situation we are today. So the lesson I draw from that is that we need to move away from the strategy of incrementalism and really go into a full-bore strategy in which we provide as much as we can the full capacity of capability the Ukrainians need on the battlefield today, not just to sustain their survivability, but to enable their survivability, but to enable them to really push the Russians back to their the original borders. And it's beyond me why we aren't going onto a full bore.
Yeah, I think we lost your audio.
Go ahead.
Ian, please go ahead. We didn't hear you for a little while. Maybe 30 seconds were gone.
What I was just saying is that in addition to amping up our military assistance to the Ukrainians, if not our more of a direct intervention in Ukraine, it's beyond me as to why we continue not to have we failed to impose a full economic embargo on Russia. I mean, we are financing the Russian invasion, and we ought to be cutting off that finance by shutting down, all purchases of Russian commodities. That is a moral imperative, and it is a strategic imperative, because by sustaining this invasion, we're actually increasing the risks of escalation.
I think that's perfectly said, Ian. By sending in equipment in dribs and drabs, by having this incremental approach, we are sustaining this war, and ultimately Russia will be able to win a war of attrition if all things are equal. It is a policy imperative for us to, I think, adopt many of the changes that you have proposed. We've got a couple hands up right now. I know some people have to go, but I do need to go to Maciej, one of our Polish contributors. Maciej, we'll go to you, and then if we have some time, because Ian has a hard stop at the top of the hour, we'll get as many questions as we can. Maciej, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so first of all, Ian, so much thankful to you that you joined our space. This is really, I think, great. You presenting a really great perspective on the things. So you said your father said that Russia won't be a democracy if it will be an empire, but he also said that Russia won't be an empire if if it won't have Ukraine under its control. So, don't you think that part of the problems that you describe, this hesitancy, stems from the fact that some people, and I think Henry Kissinger was the one that expressed this attitude overtly, think that there is no other way than Ukraine to be part of Russian sphere of influence, that you have to always build this security in Europe on as a balancing act between the West and Russia has to be respected. So I wonder, how influential is this line of thinking still, do you think, in Europe and in the US, and how do you counter that, or how you make realistic, not morally based arguments against that approach? Thank you.
Thanks much, and thanks for the kind words. I mean, what you heard from Henry Kissinger was a great friend of my father's. Were hallmarks of détente, and détente was essentially a strategy of accommodation to a Soviet sphere of influence over Central and Eastern Europe. And unfortunately, the hallmarks of that strategy still resonate apparently readily in the halls of Western Europe, and to a certain degree even here in Washington, D.C. And I think that's a recipe to reverse any kind of progress we've seen in Russia towards democratic reform and towards its transition to being a normal, peaceful international actor. And I'm not trying to infer this, but there was significant progress made over the last couple of decades, but there were real hopes in that direction in the initial decade after the end of the Cold War. And, I agree with my father. Ukraine is an independent nation. It is an independent nationality. It is a nationality that wants to be European, not Eurasian. And these people have a right to their sovereignty and their independence and to their geopolitical alignments. And the mistake of Western policy has been basically to leave Ukraine in a gray zone of insecurity out of fear that we might in some way alienate Russia or provoke Russia. And in my humble opinion, there's nothing aggressive about enabling Ukraine to fulfill its own aspiration to join institutions like the European Union and like NATO. Those are not things that we're asking of the Ukrainians. Those are objectives Ukrainians are asking of the West on their own initiative without any prodding. And the sad thing is, it's not in any way threatening to Russia. Ironically, a stable, secure Ukraine, fully integrated in the European market, full member of the transatlantic community, is actually to the benefit of Russia. It certainly provides a geopolitical context more conducive to Russia's transformation into a true democracy. And more importantly, a more vibrant and more prosperous Ukraine leads to a more vibrant and prosperous economic relationship between the two nations, Russia and Ukraine. So there's nothing threatening about Ukraine's transatlantic European aspirations. What has been destabilizing has been the West's failure to embrace those aspirations, basically banning Ukraine to a gray zone of insecurity that has unfortunately only fed, if not increased, Putin's appetite and his geopolitical appetite and his revanchist ambitions, his demand for a sphere of influence, if not direct territorial control over portions of Central and Eastern Europe, certainly those within what we call the space of the former Soviet Union.
Ian, we've got about 9 minutes left. I can tell you my DMs are filling up with extremely positive responses. There's a lot of questions in my DMs, et cetera, but we've got about 9 minutes left. Raver, I'm going to give you a question, and then Ian, I've got a final question for you. Thank you so much. This has been, frankly speaking, one of our best discussions we've had in a very long time, and the audience certainly is agreeing with that. Raver, floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning, Ian. Earlier you had praised the Biden administration's leadership, and I fully agree with you. And I'm from a bright red state, and so far my congressional representatives and senators have been fully on board. How do we keep this bipartisan unity together going forward, so Putin doesn't think that he can just wait till November and then get some breathing room. I think, how do we keep the pro-Ukrainian spirit alive in American politics?
Thanks, Raver. That's a really good question, because I am getting increasingly concerned about kind of fatigue with, the challenges posed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine here in the United States, and certainly in Western Europe, and perhaps even elsewhere. Here in the United States, it's a real matter, I think, of our bipartisan leadership here in Washington.
Ian, did we lose you?
Same as before. Wait 15 seconds.
Mic check. Ian? Yep. Doman, I heard you. Ian, are you there? And also...
Go ahead.
Keep going, Ian.
So we lost you for 30 seconds again. Bipartisan leadership here in Washington was the last we heard.
My goodness. Basically, what I was trying to say is that it's important for our bipartisan leadership here, the administration, as well as Democratic and Republican leaders in the United States, to go to the hustings and constantly remind the American citizens about what is at stake here and why it's in their interest. What are the moral issues at stake? What are the strategic issues at stake? And Americans, I believe, are powerful believers in democracy and in sovereignty, and recognize what is at stake when they see that trampled on, particularly in a country like Ukraine. That's why support and interest in this conflict was so high. But it takes leadership effort and time to constantly remind people what is going on, what we're doing. And I believe most Americans will be willing to kind of roll up their sleeves and endure the sacrifices necessary to ensure Ukraine victory. That's what America is all about, and that's what makes Americans proud about themselves and America's role in the world.
I agree fully. Ian, we've got a question from Spring. She is a geographer in Portugal who has been tracking events in Ukraine for a very long while. I have learned from her. Spring, would you like to present your question?
Yes, thank you. It was, congratulations, Jan. Finally, I got to hear someone that bring me some hope and put the things straight as I like. Thank you very much for that. The fear of escalation is something that is insane in my point of view. And we are dealing with Russia that invaded a sovereign country with no reason. I think the long-range weapons are needed to a country that needs to survive. What are we still afraid in Western world is my question. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Spring. You're very kind with your words. I mean, one of the weaknesses of the West's response to this invasion of Ukraine has been the way we responded to Russia's nuclear threats. They've been part of a strategy designed to, temper, if not block, Western support to Ukraine. And, instead of responding robustly to those threats and firmly to those threats, we've immediately announced what we're going to take off the table: U.S. military engagement in Ukraine. We even have explained the denial of certain types of military systems, airplanes, long-range artillery, long-range rocket capabilities to Ukraine, on the grounds that we can't risk the Third World War. And unfortunately, that just encourages Putin to increase his threats. And that's what we've seen over the course of this conflict. He's become more belligerent with those threats rather than less belligerent with those threats. And I'm increasingly worried about what the impact of this conflict and our response, in particular our response to this dimension of the conflict, means for nuclear stability, not just in Ukraine, but beyond Ukraine. First, I think when Putin sees the West respond this way to his nuclear threats, it actually increases the likelihood he'll exercise those threats, because he sees the reaction and we start pushing back later on. He's going to become, oh my gosh, I need to act on this, because he's setting himself up to use and create dynamics that almost encourage, if not require him to act on his own threats. That's destabilizing. And then who knows what lessons the Chinese are learning from this conflict as they think about what next steps they want to take on Taiwan. Clearly, if you want to prevent the United States from entering the conflict zone of a nation that you're attacking, well, Putin has demonstrated nuclear threats are probably an option worthy of consideration. And then, of course, how did this response affect, the future of nuclear proliferation in the world? All those states who feel that they got revanchist ambitions to act upon are going to be thinking about, what else do I need in my arsenal to ensure success in the pursuit of those ambitions? And of course, those states that face that kind of threat are going to be wondering, what do I need to defend against that kind of ambition? What did Ukraine regret doing back in 1994 that it's paying a price for very directly today? Those are some of the lessons that are probably percolating around the globe today as a consequence of the West's unfortunate response to Putin's nuclear threats. And it's very disconcerting to me.
Ian, I'm going to give up my final question, and I'm going to hand over the final question to Sir Britt, who walks the halls of the British Ministry of Defence. Sir Britt, the final question is yours. We've got about 2 minutes left. Make it pithy, and Ian will respond.
Cheers. Thank you very much, Ian. I just want to say it's an absolute pleasure. I've loved your commentary very much. I want a quick question about how do you think we can better improve the relationship between defence and government or parliament or whatever happens to be to a respective country? The reason I ask this is because some time before the invasion, British and American intelligence was incredibly clear that we knew Russia was going to invade. We tried to adopt different strategies internally. The Americans chose to adopt a strategy of exposing this intelligence to somewhat declassified level. However, the British tried to amass huge amounts of pressure to get the government to start sending arms ASAP. And this is why in the first few days when the intelligence was being released, the UK began pouring in thousands of NLAWs, anti-tank missiles. However, we knew a long time before that. And I will admit something to you. When I knew Ukraine was going in, and the day that it happened, I cried to myself because I knew that we had failed to communicate to the government the seriousness of what was going on. And I just want to ask your opinion on how do we better improve that channel of communication?
If I could clarify, how do we improve our channel of communication between our intelligence services and Ukrainian intelligence services?
Not just intelligence, but from like intelligence, the DoD, the Ministry of Defense, organizations like this, that when we talk to the government on a weekly basis and we say to them, this is going to happen, and they don't listen to us, how do we move the political will to meet the defense will?
Through action. And I think one of the reasons why our warnings to Ukrainians weren't as deeply accepted or readily accepted was the fact there was a fair amount of frustration between the Ukrainian government and the United States government and our allies, because they were living firsthand this Russian military buildup, yet we weren't doing anything, and that's a recipe for distrust and frustration, and certainly frustration and certainly distrust. Sometimes make it more difficult for a country to accept what we're telling them. Also, what I don't know is, I know we were telling them what we thought was going to happen. But I don't know how much data we provided them to give credibility to those conclusions.
I think it's more about what Sir Britt was highlighting, more about the failure of Western governments to heed the advice by its own intelligence agencies and the ministries of defense, respectively, Army intelligence or Air Force intelligence, because I completely agree with Sir Britt. The intelligence was given, it was presented for months and months and months. There's the famous story, which has been well verified, that the eve of the invasion, the German government was yet again advised by its military and its intelligence services that this would happen, and they denied that this could be possible. And even the highest military leader, who is not as engaged in daily business as he probably should be, denied that this could be true.
If I could add to that,
Sir Britt is leading at.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I have always, in my experience, I found that intelligence communities on both sides of the Atlantic actually be pretty prescient about what Russia's up to, where it's heading, and what its intentions are. What's been a failure is that the policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic and the transatlantic community have tended to project their own value systems, their own definitions of interest, their own definitions of what's good and bad and what should be done and shouldn't be done upon Putin and his coterie of advisors. And we've always been saying it would be irrational for Putin to invade Ukraine. That projection of our values, of our perspective on the world, it has been a fundamental drag on our ability to understand where Putin is headed, to project where Putin is headed, and ultimately to act in ways necessary to counter that. And it's been a perennial problem in Western policy over the last 3 decades.
Mirror imaging. That has been a perennial problem. Correct, Ian. Well said. Ian, I want to thank you for joining us. You have actually introduced some fresh, bold, and interesting, cool ideas. I actually liked your points about being more aggressive, creating a humanitarian space that would communicate our resolve to support Ukraine, and obviously communicating to the Ukrainians and the Russians at the same time that we have skin in this game. And we are not going to run away. And I think we have some variance right now in our current policies, and that must be addressed. Ian, you have been one of the shining lights in our conversations over 3 months. Axel, I'll give you the final word, and then Ian does have a hard stop, so he has to leave. But Ian, thank you again.
Thank you, Peter. You're very kind. Appreciate this. It's great to be on.
I'll make this short and sweet. Ian, we shall hope to have you back with us and discuss both with our panel as well as maybe other guests together when we have them around, the pertinent points as to how to win this war. Ukraine needs more voices. It requires more information awareness. It needs strong speakers, and I can only therefore apply to the whole community here today to tweet, retweet, and share this space. Make sure that we get more people to discuss this, because the more people are aware, the more people are involved, and the more people listen to what Ian, you just highlighted during this talk, the better we are for it, because then Russia can be repelled and Ukraine attain its freedom. Thank you for that, Ian.
Thank you all. Take care.
Cheers, Ian.